You've all heard of the German FLAK 88 that terrified Allied tank crews. But what the Germans used to destroy over 50,000 Allied tanks was actually this thing, the PAK 40, along with its assault gun and tank versions. When World War II began, the standard German anti-tank weapon was the 3.7cm PAK 36, with PAK standing for Panzerabwehrkanon, which literally means Armor Defense Cannon. It was small and light and enough to deal with most of the tanks in 1939. There were some tanks, like the Matilda II and Char B1, that gave these small anti-tank guns a lot of trouble early during the invasion of France, as they had armor more than double what those guns could penetrate. This is why the PAK 36 got the nickname Door Knocker. However, the Germans already knew that the gun was almost obsolete when the war began, and they had plans to replace it with the PAK 38 in 5cm caliber, as soon as production could catch up. The PAK 38 went into combat use in 1941, and it was again enough to deal with most Allied tanks of the time, until all of a sudden, it wasn't. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union, German intelligence thought that light tanks were the only armor the Soviets had, but deep in enemy territory, the Germans then encountered tanks they didn't know existed. These were the T-34 medium and the KV-1 heavy tank, which gave even the improved German PAK 38 a lot of trouble again. The 5cm shell would bounce off the T-34's sloped frontal armor, so the only way to penetrate it reliably was from the side at closer distances. And with the KV-1 it was even worse, as it was heavily armored all around. The Germans panicked after the first few encounters with these tanks that drove through their lines mostly unfazed by the anti-tank fire. They were literally crushing German guns under their tracks. Luckily for the Germans, they had their famous 88 FLAK, short for Flugabwehrkanon, meaning aircraft defense cannon. So it was used in emergencies to destroy tanks, as it had a big, fast-moving shell, and for a brief moment it was the only German weapon that could deal with the Soviet heavy armor. But there were too few of them at the time in the war, and more importantly, anti-aircraft guns were not made for this job. They were too tall, bulky, and exposed for the job of ambushing tanks. Anti-tank guns were much lower to the ground, with a small shield to protect the crew from shrapnel and rifle fire. Now, the Germans had already predicted that something like this would eventually happen when tank armor became thicker, so they had plans for a 7.5cm anti-tank gun, but had just never put them into action. And now, as the panicking reports came in from the Eastern Front, the PAK 40 was rushed into production. The PAK 40 was pretty much the scaled-up PAK 38, in 7.5cm caliber, with the same basic layout and mechanism, just bigger. But there's one catch with the PAK 40. From the beginning, it was built in two forms. One was a towed anti-tank gun for the troops, and the second was a modified version for tanks and assault guns. This tank version was called the KWK-40, Kampfwagenkanon, meaning Fighting Vehicle Cannon. This one fired the same armor-piercing projectile as the towed version, but it had a shorter cartridge case, so the complete round would take up less space inside the tank. And as you're about to hear, these two are going to do the heaviest tank killing of the war in some terrifying tank ambushes. But before that, there was one problem with the PAK 40 that would haunt its crews throughout the war. As the lightweight materials were now urgently needed for the Luftwaffe, the PAK 40 was built almost entirely from steel, which made it much, much heavier than the smaller PAK 38 that used light alloy to keep the weight down. And this is going to be a huge problem for the combat that was about to come. The PAK 40 sat on a split-trail carriage with two wheels and two long legs that spread apart and dug into the ground behind the gun, so the recoil wouldn't blow the whole thing back. The gun could traverse some 65 degrees from side to side without moving the whole carriage. There was a big muzzle brake to help reduce the tremendous recoil this thing had. And what's important is that the PAK 40 was just about 1.2 meters high, and that low profile, unlike the tall 88 FLAK, gave it its biggest advantage. It could dig in behind a small bank or hedge and sit there, impossible for the enemy tanks to see, until it was too late. The crew had two 4mm thick shield plates, with a gap in between for better protection against shrapnel and small arms fire. One more important feature for the ambushes you're now going to hear about is the horizontal sliding semi-automatic breech, which kicked out the spent case after firing. The breech was left open after firing so the loader could hold the next shell in his hands and load the gun immediately. The breech would then automatically close, and the gun was ready to fire again. A good crew could put out some 15 rounds a minute. It fired a standard armor-piercing shell called the Panzergranate 39 at some 750 meters a second, and it could go through about 100 millimeters of armor, which was now more than enough to ruin the day for any Allied tank. It also carried a tracer in its base, so the gunner could see where the round was going, plus a small explosive charge that would go off inside the tank and do horrible damage. There was also the Panzergranate 40, which had a sub-caliber core of tungsten carbide, an extremely hard metal, much harder than steel. It left the muzzle at some 950 meters per second, and it could go through much thicker armor. But the round was always in short supply, as tungsten was difficult to come by. There were also some less often used high-explosive anti-tank rounds, the Granatpatrone 38 series. And of course there was a high-explosive shell, the Sprenggranat 34, that the PAK-40 could fire against infantry or bunkers. The PAK-40s reached the front throughout 1942, slowly at first, but then Hitler personally ordered the highest possible production. By 1943, it was the backbone of German anti-tank defense, the weapon an Allied or Soviet tank was most likely to run into. Very soon, the Germans perfected a tank-killing tactic on the Eastern Front, called the PAK front. Because their guns were spread thinly across a wide area and were getting overrun by the mass Soviet tank charges, the Germans put the anti-tank guns into groups of about 10 instead of spreading them out along the line. The guns were all under a single commander, who chose targets and controlled when they fired. The guns were dug in and hidden in well-prepared overlapping positions along the routes where the enemy tanks were expected to come. When the tanks arrived, the Germans held their fire for as long as possible, so the tanks would drive deep into the kill zone. The commander then assigned each gun its tank, and once the moment was right, he ordered fire to be opened all at once. The advancing tanks had no idea what was going on, as they were all of a sudden getting hit from all sides by several guns. And the result was devastating. Whole columns of tanks could get destroyed this way in just a few minutes. The funny thing is that the Soviets actually took this tactic from the Germans and used it on a much larger scale during the Battle of Kursk, where they wrecked German tanks with prepared kill zones of mines, obstacles, artillery, and anti-tank guns. The PAK-40 was also wreaking havoc on the Allied tanks in the West. After D-Day, American and British tanks were moving through the Normandy and Bocage terrain, which was just perfect for ambushes. The Germans dug in and camouflaged their anti-tank guns in thick hedgerows, and destroyed a huge number of advancing Allied tanks that never saw it coming. It was actually the biggest cause of Allied tank losses at that point in the war. Most of the time, the unsuspecting tank crew would just be driving, and the next moment they'd get hit by a round that almost always penetrated the armor and exploded inside. Now, as for the crew of the anti-tank guns, despite having the right tool for their job, it was quite a terrifying experience. They had to patiently wait for the tank to come close and for the order to open fire, and if anything went wrong, all the tanks would figure out where the fire was coming from by the huge muzzle blast of the PAK-40. You'd be praying that first round hit the target, because otherwise it was the tank's turn to fire back at you. The biggest flaw of the PAK-40 was its weight. It came in over 1.4 tons, and unlike its lighter predecessors, the PAK-40 couldn't really be moved much by hand. The crew needed a tractor, or at least horses, if they wanted to fall back or reposition. And doing that on soft ground or snow was even worse, as you can imagine. So when the line was broken, most of the time the PAK-40 had to be left behind, some destroyed by their own crews, but many captured intact by the enemy. And this is why the same gun was adapted for tanks, so it got mobility and its full tank-killing potential was unlocked. The Panzer IV started its career as an infantry support vehicle, where it carried that short-barreled 7.5cm howitzer-style gun. It fired low-velocity, high-explosive shells to blast fortifications and soft targets, while the Panzer III was Germany's dedicated tank for fighting other tanks. The Panzer III was at first armed with the 3.7cm gun, then upgunned to 5cm, and then to a 5cm with a longer barrel. When the crisis with the heavier tanks proved that these guns were still not enough, the Panzer III couldn't be upgraded anymore, because its turret ring was too small to hold any gun bigger than that 5cm. However, the Panzer IV had the larger turret ring and could hold the new WK-40, which, if you remember what I said earlier, is the modified PAK-40 for tank use. Now, the Panzer IV with the long gun, or what Allies called the Panzer IV Special, became quite a tank killer, despite never being designed for such a job. Exactly the same thing happened with the Stug III. It was also built for infantry support as an assault gun and armed with the same gun as the original Panzer IV. But it now got the new anti-tank gun called the Stück 40, the same gun just slightly modified for the assault guns, which was devastatingly effective with the low-lying Stück 3. It was the greatest German tank destroyer, and when the Germans saw how well these two performed with the new gun, and because the biggest flaw of the towed PAK 40 was its lack of mobility, they began putting it on everything else that could carry one. The Germans had various tanks they'd captured from the French and Czechs, or used their own obsolete Panzer II chassis to mount the anti-tank gun on. This is how the Marder tank destroyers were born, with the gun added to whatever chassis was available. There was even an 8-wheeled armoured car or half-tracks that carried the anti-tank gun, or the desperate RSO, when the PAK 40 was mounted on a modified farm tractor. The Jagdpanzer IV arrived in 1944, and it was a purpose-built tank destroyer on the Panzer IV chassis, with the modified PAK 40 called the PAK 39. That was the same gun the Hetzer tank destroyer got. The Stück 4 was the same idea as the Stück 3, just based on the Panzer IV chassis when Allied bombing knocked out the main Stück 3 factory and halted its production. Anyway, the gun proved that it could kill almost anything the Allies had. But then new Soviet heavy tanks appeared, like the IS-2, with well-sloped frontal armor that was effective even against the much more powerful 88. The Americans got their M26 Pershing towards the end of the war, but it was the Soviet heavy tanks that arrived first, when the Germans realized that soon they'd need to upgrade their anti-tank guns yet again. The gun had been improved earlier, back in 1943, when the barrel was made some 50 centimeters longer. The longer barrel gave the projectile a higher velocity, as the propellant had more time to burn behind it inside the barrel. By 1945, there wasn't much the Germans could do to stop the onslaught of the Allied tanks across all fronts, and despite inflicting heavy losses, they were getting overrun and pushed back until the war ended. But the end of the war didn't mean the end of the PAK 40 and its versions. It actually went on for a few decades with some various armies that kept these guns, and Syrian Panzer IVs and Stugs were firing on Israeli tanks in the 1960s during their conflict.